Step away from the illegal farm, sir. The cops are on their way. I looked up from my morning coffee to see my new HOA president, a woman in her late 50s with the aggressive stance of a drill sergeant, pointing a manicured finger at my vegetable garden like it was a crime scene. My chickens clucked softly behind me, utterly unfazed. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting her words sink in. Illegal farm? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Karen, as she had introduced herself in a condescending tone the day I moved in, huffed like I had just questioned the laws of physics. Yes, illegal. This is a residential neighborhood, not some backwoods livestock operation. The HOA does not allow unsightly farming operations. You'll need to remove all of it immediately. I leaned against my porch railing, suppressing a smirk. Karen, it's a tomato patch and 6 chickens. She clutched her clipboard like it was a sacred text. It doesn't matter. We have strict regulations, and you are in violation of several of them. She flipped a page dramatically. Unauthorized livestock, unapproved gardening, and, she squinted, as if searching for the worst offense, an unregistered shed. I glanced at my old wooden tool shed, which had probably been here since the dinosaurs roamed. You mean the shed that came with the property? She ignored me. I'm giving you a warning. Either remove all of this, or I'll be forced to report you. I gave her my best polite smile, the one I usually reserved for drunk people resisting arrest. I appreciate your concern, Karen, but I own this property, and I'm well within my rights to have a small garden and a few chickens. Her eyes narrowed. We'll see about that. With a dramatic turn, she stomped away, already dialing her phone. I sighed, watching her retreat. A part of me almost felt bad. Almost. She had no idea she had just called the cops on the county sheriff. The thing is, I moved into this HOA neighborhood to take a break. I had been working in law enforcement for over 20 years, dealing with criminals, high-stress situations, and enough paperwork to wallpaper the Grand Canyon. When I saw this house, a quiet little place on the outskirts with enough land to plant a few vegetables and keep some chickens, I thought it would be perfect, peaceful, a place where I didn't have to deal with nonsense. Then I met Karen. Within my first week, she had already fined my next-door neighbor for leaving his trash cans out 5 minutes past collection time and cited another for having grass that exceeded HOA-approved lengths. She ran this place like a tyrant with a gavel, handing out violations like Halloween candy. And now, she had made the grave mistake of thinking she could boss me around. It didn't take long for the situation to escalate. Not even 10 minutes after Karen had disappeared, I heard the sound of approaching sirens. I sipped my coffee, watching as a squad car pulled up. 2 uniformed officers stepped out, looking around like they had just arrived at the scene of an active crime. Karen emerged from her house, arms crossed, a smug look on her face. That's him. He's the one running an illegal farming operation. The officers exchanged glances, then turned toward me. I gave them a friendly wave. One of them, Officer Daniels, blinked. Sheriff Hudson. Karen frowned, glancing between us. Wait, you know this criminal? Daniels cleared his throat, trying to keep his face neutral. Karen, this is Sheriff Jake Hudson. He's our boss. Silence. A long, glorious silence. Karen's face turned a shade of red I had only ever seen on warning labels. That can't be right, she stammered. He's breaking the rules. Daniels rubbed the back of his neck, clearly struggling not to laugh. Karen, with all due respect, he's literally the sheriff. Karen's eyes darted to me, as if expecting me to deny it. I gave her an easygoing smile, then reached into my back pocket and pulled out my badge, holding it up for her to see. Yep, that's me. Karen's jaw clenched. That doesn't change anything, she sputtered. You're still violating HOA rules. The second officer, Johnson, finally gave up and chuckled. Ma'am, we're county law enforcement. HOA rules don't override state and local laws. Karen looked like she might explode. But, I decided to have a little fun. Karen, I appreciate you looking out for the neighborhood, I said, stepping forward. And I take every reported crime very seriously. So, as the sheriff, I'm going to launch a full investigation into this matter. Her eyes lit up for a second before I continued, and while I'm at it, I might as well check if there are any irregularities in the HOA's operations. You know, misuse of funds, illegal fines, things like that. Her smug expression evaporated. That won't be necessary. Oh, I think it will, I said, pulling out my notepad for effect. See, HOA fraud is a real problem. And I've been hearing some interesting things about how fines have been handled around here. Daniels coughed, failing to hide another laugh. Karen took a step back. This is harassment. You're harassing me in my own neighborhood. I smiled. I'm just enforcing the law, Karen. For the first time since I met her, she had no response. She turned on her heel and stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. The officers shook their heads, amused. Sheriff, you do realize she's probably going to try something else, right? Daniels asked. Oh, I'm counting on it, I said, tossing the rest of my coffee back. This is going to be fun. And just like that, the battle between me and HOA Karen officially began. The next morning, I woke up to an official-looking letter taped to my front door. In big, bold letters, it read Urgent Notice of Violation. Beneath it, a long-winded explanation accused me of everything from unauthorized livestock to creating an unsightly environment that lowers neighborhood appeal. The kicker? A fine of $500 for my supposed infractions, payable to the HOA within 10 days. I chuckled, shaking my head. Karen wasn't wasting any time. I had barely finished my first cup of coffee before she had already gone full bureaucratic warfare on me. She had clearly underestimated how much I enjoyed a good fight. Instead of taking the letter inside, I walked right over to Karen's house. Her yard was pristine, her porch decorated with perfectly symmetrical flower pots. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, she swung it open, her face already twisted into a triumphant smirk. I see you received your violation notice, she said, her tone dripping with satisfaction. I held up the paper. I did. It's a nice piece of fiction, but I have a couple of questions. She crossed her arms. There's nothing to question. You're in violation of HOA guidelines, and as president, it's my duty to enforce them. I gestured toward my house. Karen, it's a small garden and a few chickens. I'm not running a commercial farm. There's no rule against homeowners having personal vegetable patches or backyard hens, and you know it. She sniffed, tilting her chin up. Actually, I found an old clause in the HOA charter that prohibits livestock and agricultural activities. I fought the urge to laugh. An old clause? From when? Karen hesitated, then muttered, 1987. I couldn't help but grin. Karen, that rule was probably written to prevent people from raising cows and pigs in their backyards. A couple of hens and tomato plants don't qualify as an agricultural activity. Her eyes flickered with irritation. That's not for you to decide. I took a step forward, lowering my voice just enough to make sure she knew I wasn't playing. Actually, it is. Because as the county sheriff, I also enforce property laws. And what you're doing here? It's harassment. Karen stiffened but quickly masked it with a smug smile. I'm simply following protocol. If you disagree, you're welcome to bring it up at the next HOA meeting. I leaned against the doorframe. You know, Karen, I did a little reading last night. Turns out, the county regulations override HOA rules when it comes to property rights. And from what I can tell, you've been handing out fines that have no legal backing. Her smile twitched. That's nonsense. I pulled a small notebook from my pocket. Is it? Because I also spoke to a few of our neighbors. Apparently, you fined Mr. Thompson $400 for having a wooden fence that didn't match the community aesthetic. You fined the Johnsons $200 because their Christmas decorations were up 2 days past your acceptable holiday decor removal window. And then there's Mrs. Parker, You fined an 80-year-old widow $300 because her mailbox was not within HOA color standards. Karen's expression hardened. That is all within my jurisdiction. I clicked my tongue. That's where you're wrong. You see, when an HOA starts issuing fines outside of legally approved regulations, it becomes fraud. And fraud? That's a crime. For the first time, I saw a flicker of real fear in her eyes. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced with stubborn defiance. You can't prove anything. I smiled. Oh, I think I can. Karen's door slammed in my face. I chuckled, turning back toward my house. I had expected her to retaliate, but this was going to be more entertaining than I thought. By noon, I got a call from my deputy, Daniels. He was laughing so hard I could barely make out what he was saying. Sheriff, you're not gonna believe this. Karen just called the county office and tried to file a complaint against you. I grinned. Oh really? What's my crime this time? She said, and I quote, "The sheriff is endangering the neighborhood with his reckless farming practices." I let out a low whistle. That's a new one. Daniels was wheezing. The clerk asked her to clarify, and she said, "Oh man, this is rich. She said your chickens are a threat to public safety." I laughed. You're kidding. Nope. Apparently, she's convinced that backyard hens are a gateway to uncontrolled rural chaos. I shook my head. Let's play along. Have a county compliance officer do an official property inspection. I want everything documented. Daniels whistled. Oh, you're really setting her up for a fall, huh? I'm just following the law, I said, unable to keep the amusement out of my voice. The next day, the compliance officer arrived, clipboard in hand. Karen practically pounced on him, leading him straight to my yard like she had uncovered a secret crime syndicate. There. Do you see that? Chickens. Unauthorized farming. A complete disregard for HOA standards. The officer scratched his head, looking at my peaceful hens pecking at the grass. Ma'am, these are just chickens. Karen's eye twitched. It doesn't matter. He's violating the rules. The officer flipped through his document. Actually, county regulations allow up to 6 backyard hens on residential properties. And as for the garden, there's no zoning law against personal vegetable patches. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But the HOA. The officer cut her off. HOA regulations cannot override county laws. And from what I see, Sheriff Hudson is well within his rights. Karen's entire body stiffened. I could practically see the gears in her head turning, trying to find another way to twist the situation in her favor. Then, as if a switch flipped, she turned to me with an eerily sweet smile. Well, Sheriff, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. Maybe I was a little overzealous in enforcing the rules. I gave her a slow nod. You don't say. She clasped her hands together. Maybe we can work something out. You know, as neighbors. I grinned. Oh, we're definitely going to work something out, Karen. I'm going to be bringing some official auditors to the next HOA meeting to go over the financial records. I'm sure you wouldn't mind a little transparency, would you? Her face drained of color. That won't be necessary. Oh, but I insist. She took a shaky breath. Sheriff, let's not be hasty. I clapped a hand on her shoulder, making sure my badge was visible. I'll see you at the meeting, Karen. And just like that, the game had changed. The HOA meeting was scheduled for 6 in the evening, and by 5:30, the community clubhouse was already packed. Word had spread fast. Neighbors who had never bothered to attend before suddenly found themselves eager to witness what was about to go down. The tension in the air was thick, and at the center of it all sat Karen, perched at the head of the long table like a queen holding court. She had that same smug expression she always wore, but there was a tightness around her eyes, a stiffness in her posture. She knew what was coming. I walked in with my deputy, Daniels, and the county compliance officer, all 3 of us carrying folders thick with documents. Karen's eyes flicked toward them before she turned to the gathered homeowners and cleared her throat, plastering on her well-practiced smile. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "I'm glad to see such a wonderful turnout for this meeting. As you all know, we are here to discuss some recent violations in our community and to ensure our beautiful neighborhood remains in pristine condition." A few people murmured, but no one was really paying attention to her. Most eyes were on me. I took a seat directly across from her, setting my files down on the table. Karen laced her fingers together. "Before we begin, I'd like to address a rather unfortunate misunderstanding regarding one of our residents." She turned her gaze on me, her smile tight. "Sheriff Hudson, I think we may have had a bit of miscommunication regarding the HOA's rules and regulations. I'd like to extend my apologies for any inconvenience." I let the silence stretch between us for a few beats before leaning back in my chair. "Is that right?" She nodded, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Yes, of course. And with that in mind, I propose that we—" I flipped open the first folder and slid a document across the table. "Before you continue, Karen, I'd like you to explain these." Karen blinked down at the papers in front of her. What is this?" "The financial records of the HOA," I said casually. "Or, should I say, the lack of financial records." The room, which had been buzzing with low conversation, went dead silent. Karen's face went stiff, her hands clutching the edges of the table. I gestured toward the compliance officer, who adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "As per the sheriff's request, we conducted a preliminary audit of the HOA's financial transactions over the past 5 years. What we found was concerning." A few neighbors leaned in, eyebrows raised. Mrs. Parker, the sweet elderly widow who had been fined for her mailbox, pursed her lips. "Concerning how?" The compliance officer adjusted his glasses again. "Well, for starters, the HOA has collected over $40,000 in fines in the last 3 years alone. However, there are no official records of how that money was spent. In fact, nearly half of those funds are unaccounted for." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Karen's face was frozen in place, her usual smugness gone. She opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. "That's not all," I continued, flipping to the next page. "We also found multiple instances where homeowners were fined for violations that do not exist in the official HOA charter." "Meaning, Karen, that you were collecting money for rules that you made up." A few people started murmuring angrily now. Mr. Thompson, the neighbor who had been fined for his wooden fence, shook his head in disbelief. "So you've been stealing from us?" Karen let out a nervous laugh, though no one joined her. "Now, let's not jump to conclusions. I assure you, every fine was issued in accordance with." Daniels, who had been enjoying himself a little too much, spoke up. "Karen, we also looked into some personal expenditures made using HOA funds. You wouldn't happen to know why the HOA was billed for multiple spa treatments, would you?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "That is—" "Oh, and let's not forget about the catered luncheons," I added, flipping another page. 16 different charges over the last year alone. Pretty fancy meals for an organization that's supposed to be using funds for neighborhood maintenance." The room exploded. People were shouting now, turning on Karen with the kind of fury only homeowners who had been nickel-and-dimed for years could summon. "You fined me for having a garden gnome, and you were spending our money on spa days? What about the new playground we were supposed to get? Where did that money go? You're a fraud, Karen." Karen's carefully constructed composure crumbled before my eyes. She slammed her hands on the table. "This is a witch hunt. I have done nothing wrong. Everything I did was for the betterment of this community." I raised an eyebrow. "Even the $500 you spent on a private chef for your anniversary dinner? Was that for the betterment of the community too?" A hush fell over the room. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. "You can't do this," she hissed. "You don't have the authority." I smiled, holding up my badge. Actually, Karen, I do. And based on the evidence we've gathered, I'm recommending a full investigation into HOA fraud and embezzlement. You might want to start thinking about legal counsel. Karen's chair screeched against the floor as she shot to her feet. You can't prove anything. The compliance officer, who had been patiently waiting, stood up and calmly placed a document in front of her. Actually, ma'am, we can. And given the scope of these findings, I think it's safe to say that your position as HOA president is terminated. Karen's breathing was erratic now. She looked around, searching for support, but there was none. The same people she had bullied for years were now staring at her with nothing but contempt. This isn't over, she snapped. Her gaze landed on me, filled with hatred. You think you've won? You think you can just come into my neighborhood and ruin everything? I folded my arms. Karen, it was never your neighborhood. It belongs to the people who actually live here. And they're tired of your nonsense. She let out a frustrated scream before shoving past the table and storming toward the exit. As she reached the door, she spun around one last time, pointing a trembling finger at me. You haven't seen the last of me, Sheriff. I grinned. Oh, I'm counting on it. The door slammed behind her, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then, as if a collective weight had been lifted, someone started clapping. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire room was cheering. People were shaking hands, hugging, laughing. Mrs. Parker wiped a tear from her eye, muttering something about how she could finally paint her mailbox whatever color she wanted. Daniels clapped me on the back. Well, Sheriff, looks like you just got yourself a new fan club. I chuckled, shaking my head. I didn't do anything special. I just made sure the law was followed. He smirked. So, does this mean you're running for HOA president? I scoffed. Not a chance. Mrs. Parker piped up from the crowd. Too late. We already nominated you. Laughter erupted, and I let out a long sigh, rubbing my temples. Maybe I had won the battle against Karen, but I had a feeling my peaceful farm life was about to get a lot more complicated.